The moment Lara stepped into the luxurious restaurant, she was immediately struck by the stark contrast between the opulent surroundings and her own sense of unease. The polished marble floors reflected the soft glow of crystal chandeliers above, while the tables were adorned with white linen and flickering candles. It was the kind of place where the wealthy dined, their laughter and clinking glasses filling the air with an air of exclusivity. The atmosphere was one of refined elegance, the kind of establishment that promised an experience not just of fine food, but of status. As Lara glanced around, she couldn't help but feel a little out of place, but she shook it off. Tonight, she was a part of this world. At least, that's what she thought. She had been invited to dinner by her husband's family, something she had been looking forward to for weeks. Derek, her husband, had assured her that his mother, Susan, had organized the dinner to celebrate a recent business success, and that it would be a chance for her to get to know the family better. The thought of finally being accepted, of showing Susan that she belonged, had kept Lara hopeful. But as she approached the host's stand, a knot formed in her stomach. The maitre d' looked at her with polite indifference, his professional smile offering no hint of recognition. She told him her name and mentioned she was here to join the Sinclair party. He glanced at the reservation book, flipping through the pages before looking back up at her. "I'm sorry, madam," he said, his tone courteous yet firm, "but there's no reservation under your name." Lara blinked, a wave of confusion sweeping over her. "That's impossible," she said, trying to mask the growing tension in her voice. "I'm here to join my husband's family for dinner. The reservation should be under Derek Sinclair's name." The maitre d' seemed to search again, his eyes scanning the book more carefully this time. He nodded and looked back at her. "There's a reservation for 6 under Derek Sinclair's name, but I'm afraid I don't have a seat for you." Lara felt a brief moment of disbelief. "You must be mistaken," she said, her voice faltering just slightly. "I'm his wife. They should already be here." The maitre d' gave a small, apologetic shrug. "I've checked the reservation.
There's no seat for you, madam."
Her heart dropped into her stomach, and the reality of the situation began to sink in. There was no mistake. This was no simple error. Lara stood there, frozen, her mind racing. She felt exposed, vulnerable, as if the walls of the restaurant had suddenly become too high and the air too thick. And then, just as the tension was about to overwhelm her, she heard a familiar voice behind her, laced with amusement. "Oh, Lara." It rang out, dripping with condescension. "Did you really think I'd include you in tonight's dinner?" Lara turned to see her mother-in-law, Susan, standing a few feet away. Her platinum blonde hair was styled perfectly, her designer dress hugging her figure with effortless grace. It was the same woman who had made it clear from the beginning that Lara would never truly belong in her world. Standing next to Susan were Derek's 2 sisters, Megan and Olivia, both smirking at her as they whispered to each other, their eyes glinting with amusement. Lara's stomach twisted, the humiliation starting to creep in, but she refused to show it. She forced a smile, trying to mask the confusion and hurt that churned inside her. "I don't understand," she said calmly, trying to keep her voice even. "I was invited to join your family for dinner. There must be some kind of mistake." Susan's smile widened as she looked Lara up and down, her expression almost mocking. "Oh, sweetheart, I didn't think you'd actually come," she said with a soft, mocking laugh. "This is a family dinner. A place like this is, well, it's a bit out of your league, don't you think?" Behind her, Megan and Olivia giggled, their voices carrying through the otherwise quiet restaurant. It felt as though everyone in the vicinity could hear them, their laughter cutting through the air like a sharp knife. Lara felt her face flush, but she stood tall, not allowing herself to shrink under the weight of their ridicule. Susan's words were a clear slap in the face, a calculated move to remind Lara of her place. She wasn't born into wealth. She didn't come from an old money family. She didn't attend Ivy League schools. She wasn't part of the exclusive world that Derek's family belonged to. And Susan had made it her life's mission to remind Lara of that every chance she got. At first, the slights had been subtle. The passive-aggressive comments about Lara's simple taste, the times Susan had conveniently forgotten to invite her to family events, the expensive gifts for Derek, while Lara was left with nothing but empty smiles and fake pleasantries. But tonight Susan had taken it to a new level. She had orchestrated this entire dinner, ensuring that Lara would be excluded, left standing at the entrance, like an unwanted outsider. And it wasn't just about the dinner. It was about reminding Lara that she didn't belong, that she was not good enough for Derek or his family. The weight of the situation pressed down on Lara's chest, but instead of succumbing to the humiliation, something inside her clicked. She wasn't going to let Susan win this time. She wasn't going to let her pull her down. Lara smiled, a slow, deliberate smile that caught Susan off guard. For just a fraction of a second, the smug expression on Susan's face faltered. Lara turned to the maitre d', her voice smooth and confident. "Would you be so kind as to ask the owner to come out?" she asked, her words cutting through the tension like a hot knife. Susan laughed dismissively, shaking her head. "Oh, please," she sneered. "Do you really think the owner of this place is going to come out just because you ask?" Lara met her gaze, refusing to back down.
Yes.
"Because the owner of this restaurant knows me very well." For the first time, Lara saw doubt flicker in Susan's eyes. She had spent years belittling her, treating her like an outsider, but now Lara was about to turn the tables. And Susan had no idea what was coming next. Susan's cruel smirk was impossible to ignore as she looked Lara up and down, clearly taking pleasure in the discomfort that radiated from her. "Oh, Lara, did you really think you'd be included in tonight's dinner?" she said, her voice dripping with mockery. "This place, well, it's a bit too high class for someone like you, don't you think?" Lara felt her stomach tighten. Susan's words were designed to hurt, to make her feel small, insignificant. It was as if Susan had been waiting for this exact moment to expose Lara for the outsider she believed her to be. The thinly veiled insult wasn't subtle. It was clear that Susan wanted everyone to know that she thought Lara wasn't worthy of sharing the same air, let alone sitting at the same table. As Susan spoke, Lara glanced at Derek, hoping for some kind of support. But instead of seeing a husband ready to defend her, she saw only discomfort. His eyes flickered between Susan and Lara, and his hands gripped his silverware tightly, but he said nothing. Not a word of defense, not even a gesture of solidarity. His silence felt louder than anything he could have said. Derek's refusal to speak up made the situation even worse, deepening the sting of Susan's verbal assault. His inability or unwillingness to confront his mother only reinforced the fact that, in this moment, Lara was truly alone. Megan and Olivia, Derek's sisters, sat back in their chairs, their faces adorned with smug grins. They weren't just indifferent to Lara's humiliation, they were enjoying it. Megan's laugh rang out from behind her wine glass, a sound that seemed to carry across the room, while Olivia shot her a look that said she was loving every second of the spectacle. Their eyes gleamed with superiority, and Lara could feel them both silently enjoying the fact that their mother had succeeded in putting her in her place. It wasn't just about dinner, it was about reasserting their power, reminding Lara of where she stood in the pecking order. The cruelty of the moment cut deeper than anything Susan had said. This wasn't just a family dinner. This was an act of control, a calculated effort to make Lara feel like she didn't belong. Lara stood there, her heart racing, but on the outside, she maintained an air of calm composure. She knew she had to stay in control, that she couldn't let them see her break. Her pride was all she had left in this room full of people who wanted her to feel small. Slowly, she turned to the waiter, her voice steady despite the turmoil inside. "Excuse me," she said, her gaze meeting his. "Could you please ask the owner to come out here? He knows me very well." The waiter blinked, clearly unsure of how to respond. He glanced between her and Susan, who was still standing with that cruel smile on her face, clearly reveling in Lara's discomfort. For a split second, the maitre d' hesitated, his eyes darting to Susan for confirmation. But then he nodded and, after a brief moment, turned to leave. Susan's laugh was sharp and filled with disbelief. "Oh, please," she scoffed. "Do you really think the owner of this place is going to come out just because you ask? You think he's going to drop everything for you?" Her voice was full of derision, and Lara could feel the weight of her words. But instead of shrinking back, Lara simply smiled, her expression unwavering. "Yes," she replied calmly, not breaking eye contact with Susan, "because he knows me very well." Lara could see the flicker of doubt in Susan's eyes for the briefest moment. The confident sneer that had dominated her face faltered, just enough for Lara to notice. It wasn't a huge crack, but it was enough. Susan hadn't expected Lara to push back, hadn't expected her to challenge her authority in this way. She had thought she was in complete control of the situation, but Lara's composed defiance was beginning to shift the power dynamic. The tension in the air grew heavier as they waited. Lara could feel the eyes of the restaurant guests starting to subtly shift toward her. The murmurs around the room began to rise, and she knew that the attention was no longer just on her mother-in-law's cruel remarks, but on what was about to happen next. She could almost feel the entire room holding its breath, waiting to see how this moment would unfold. Lara's internal resolve began to strengthen. She wasn't just standing up for herself now, she was taking back control. As Susan continued to mock her, she allowed herself a slow, deliberate smile, one that made her mother-in-law's expression falter again. It was the kind of smile that conveyed confidence, a quiet power that spoke volumes without needing to say a word. And in that brief moment, as the smile lingered, Lara knew she had shifted the power in the room. Susan's control was slipping. This dinner was no longer about humiliating Lara. It was about her chance to show everyone, especially Susan, that she was not someone to be dismissed. The maitre d' returned then, and the moment of truth was at hand. Susan's face was now a mix of irritation and uncertainty, and Lara, standing tall, couldn't help but feel a sense of victory already starting to bloom within her. The moment the maitre d' stepped aside, Lara stood tall, her heart pounding, knowing what was about to happen. The air in the restaurant felt thick with anticipation. She had expected some resistance from Susan, but now the room was on the cusp of a much larger shift. As the sound of footsteps approached, Lara turned her head toward the figure emerging from the back of the restaurant. Daniel walked toward her with the same commanding presence he had always carried. In his early 50s, Daniel was the epitome of refined elegance. His salt and pepper hair was perfectly groomed, and he wore a tailored suit that seemed to effortlessly convey both power and grace. There was an undeniable confidence in his stride, as if he was a man who had mastered not only the art of fine dining but also the delicate balance of making people feel respected while maintaining control. His deep-set eyes met Lara's, and his smile spread as he caught sight of her. "Lara," he said warmly, his voice a mix of surprise and familiarity. "It's been too long." Lara smiled back, the tension in her chest slowly unwinding. "It has," she replied, her voice steady. "Good to see you, Daniel." The guests around the restaurant seemed to notice the change in the atmosphere, sensing that this wasn't an ordinary exchange. As Daniel approached her, the faint murmurs of the room quieted, and the subtle shift in the dynamic became more apparent. This was no longer just an ordinary dinner. This was a moment of reckoning for everyone involved. Susan, who had been smirking in the background, now stood frozen for a moment as she watched Daniel approach. Her lips parted slightly in surprise, but she quickly recovered, adopting the same smug expression she had worn since Lara had entered the restaurant. It was clear she hadn't expected Lara to have any connection to someone like Daniel, let alone someone who commanded this level of respect in such a high-end restaurant. Daniel turned his attention to the table where Derek's family sat, his gaze sweeping over each of them before returning to Lara. "What brings you here tonight?" he asked, genuinely curious. Lara casually gestured to the table where Derek's family was seated. "Apparently, I wasn't included in the reservation," she said lightly, her words almost as if she were discussing an insignificant detail. "A bit of an oversight, wouldn't you say?" The maitre d', who had been standing awkwardly to the side, was now looking from Daniel to Susan, and then to Lara. The entire situation had shifted from one of awkward rejection to one of quiet admiration for Lara's composed demeanor and the fact that the owner of such a prestigious establishment was engaging with her so personally. Susan, of course, wasn't going to let this moment pass without trying to exert control. She scoffed, crossing her arms tightly over her chest, her voice dripping with disbelief. "Oh, please, she said dismissively. Do you really think the owner of this place will come out here just because you ask? This is a private dining establishment, not somewhere you can just waltz in and expect a seat. But Daniel didn't even flinch. He simply turned to the maitre d', his expression calm and unyielding. You're absolutely right, Mrs. Hunt, he replied smoothly, his voice tinged with a subtle edge. This restaurant doesn't accept walk-ins, but Lara here is not just anyone. He paused, allowing the weight of his words to settle in the air before adding with firm authority, she is family. For the first time, Susan's smirk faltered. Her eyes widened, and she blinked rapidly, clearly stunned by Daniel's declaration. Lara's calm presence and confidence had caught her off guard. She had been prepared for the typical subservience, the meekness that she had come to expect from Lara over the years. But this was something different. Family? Susan echoed, her voice tinged with incredulity. This is ridiculous. She's Derek's wife, not someone who belongs in our circle, not someone you should be offering special treatment to. But Daniel didn't waver. His eyes never left Lara, and the respect in his gaze was undeniable. Lara's contribution to the fine dining world isn't just as an ordinary guest, he said, turning back to face Susan and the rest of the table. She's one of the most talented individuals I've had the privilege of mentoring. She trained under me when she was just starting out, and I've watched her grow into a brilliant professional. She knows hospitality, and she knows high-end service better than anyone. Lara could feel the weight of Daniel's words, and for the first time that night, she felt like she was standing on solid ground again. She had always known what she was capable of, but hearing Daniel speak of her so highly in front of Susan and her family, well, it felt like a small victory. Megan and Olivia, who had been laughing behind their wine glasses, fell silent. The guests around the restaurant, who had been watching the scene unfold, began whispering among themselves. The shift in the room was palpable. Lara was no longer the outsider they had once seen her as. She was someone worthy of respect. I never realized, Megan started, her voice trailing off as she looked at Lara with a mixture of surprise and hesitation. You didn't realize because you never bothered to get to know me, Lara said, cutting her off. Her voice was calm, but there was an edge to it now. She wasn't going to let anyone take this moment from her. The maitre d', still standing by, now moved forward to set a table for Lara, a seat placed directly next to Derek's, an unspoken acknowledgement of her status in the room. Susan's face was now a shade of crimson, her earlier smugness replaced by something else, something close to defeat. She opened her mouth, as if to say something, but the words didn't come. There was nothing more she could say that would undo the reality of the situation. The rest of the family, Derek included, remained silent. It wasn't just Lara they had underestimated, it was the quiet power she had always carried with her. They hadn't realized it until now, but Lara was no longer the meek woman they had tried to push around. She was her own person, and she had just made sure that everyone knew it. Susan's composure, once so carefully cultivated, began to crack as Daniel stepped back, leaving her standing there, flustered and angry. The way Lara had so calmly demanded a seat, not just for herself, but with the respect of the restaurant's owner, had clearly caught Susan off guard. Her perfectly made-up face, usually a mask of control, was now tinged with frustration. She opened her mouth, but no words came out at first. She was caught in a rare moment of being outmaneuvered, and she didn't like it. Finally, Susan regained some semblance of control and crossed her arms, her stance defensive, her lips pressed into a tight line. This is absurd, she muttered, more to herself than to anyone else, but loud enough for the table to hear. Then, addressing Lara, she sneered, I don't know what kind of game you're playing, but you're still not one of us. You may have managed to worm your way into this dinner, but don't think for a second that you've earned the right to sit here with people of our caliber. Lara didn't flinch. Instead, she remained perfectly poised, her calmness almost unnerving as she met Susan's scorn with quiet confidence. And who, exactly, are people of your caliber? She asked, her voice still measured but with a sharp edge that made it clear she wasn't going to back down. Because if your idea of caliber is defined by your inherited wealth and superficial status, then I guess I'm glad I don't belong. The words hung in the air, and Susan's face flushed with rage. She wasn't used to being challenged, least of all by someone she had spent years belittling. Lara wasn't the naive, submissive woman she had once thought her to be. No, Lara had grown stronger. Her success wasn't handed to her, and that truth stung Susan deeply. "Let's get one thing straight," Susan continued, her voice dripping with condescension. "Your career in hospitality? That's cute, but it's hardly the path I expected for someone with your potential." She paused, her eyes scanning Lara as if she were a specimen under a microscope. "I always thought you'd end up doing something bigger, something that actually mattered. But I suppose it's easy for someone like you to fall into what's familiar, serving others, right?" Lara felt a brief flicker of anger, but she suppressed it. She wasn't about to let Susan's attempt to reduce her to something less than she was get under her skin. Lara leaned in slightly, her voice low and controlled. "You're right, Susan. I did serve others. But in doing so, I learned something that you, with all your wealth and privilege, have clearly never grasped: the value of hard work, the importance of earning what you have, and the dignity that comes from building something on your own." There was a noticeable shift in the atmosphere around the table. Derek, who had been silent through much of the exchange, fidgeted with his napkin, his discomfort growing. His sisters, Megan and Olivia, exchanged quick, uneasy glances, clearly unsure of how to react. Susan's carefully crafted image of superiority was being dismantled piece by piece, and it was becoming harder for her to maintain her position. "You think your little hospitality career qualifies you to sit at this table?" Susan spat, her voice rising with frustration. "You're nothing more than a glorified waitress playing dress-up in a world you'll never truly belong to. It's laughable that you think you can compete with real success." Lara's eyes hardened, her jaw tightening. She was done letting Susan define her. With a slow breath, Lara spoke again, her voice calm but with an undeniable strength. "I don't need to compete with you, Susan. I'm not trying to be like you, or anyone else at this table. I built my career on my own, and every step I've taken has been because of my own ambition, not a legacy handed to me. I don't need your approval to know my worth." The table fell into a heavy silence, the weight of Lara's words hanging in the air. Susan opened her mouth to retort, but the words seemed to stick in her throat. She wasn't used to being challenged, especially not by someone she had spent years undermining. She opened her mouth again but only let out a frustrated sigh, her eyes narrowing. It was clear she didn't know how to regain control of the conversation. Lara sat back in her chair, the quiet confidence she exuded now a palpable force in the room. She could feel the tension shifting. This wasn't just a battle of words anymore, it was a battle of power. And for the first time, Lara felt like she was the one holding the reins. Around her, the unease among Derek's family grew. Megan, usually the one most eager to mock Lara, was now shifting uncomfortably in her seat. Olivia, who had always been quick to laugh at Lara's expense, now had her eyes downcast, her hand nervously tapping her wine glass. Derek, whose silence had been deafening until now, was looking anywhere but at Lara, his fingers white from gripping his fork. Lara could see the realization dawning on Derek's sisters. They weren't just witnessing an embarrassing moment for Lara anymore. They were beginning to understand that their mother's behavior was no longer just a personal vendetta, it was starting to put their family's reputation at risk. The shift in the atmosphere wasn't just a result of Lara's defiance, it was the unraveling of a carefully constructed facade, and they all knew it. The tables had turned, and there was no going back. Susan could feel it too. The fear was creeping into her expression, even as she tried to maintain her posture of superiority. The cracks were widening, and for the first time, she realized that the power she had so long wielded over Lara and over her family was slipping away. Lara sat back in her chair, her gaze unwavering as she took a deep breath, ready to reveal the truth that had been hidden for far too long. "You think Derek built this business on his own," she began, her voice calm but firm. "But the reality is, without me, there would be no business to speak of." She paused, letting the weight of her words sink in. "I've funded many of Derek's ventures. I own a significant percentage of his business. The empire you all think is his? It's mine, too. I've been the one behind it from the start, quietly supporting him, building the foundation. The room fell into stunned silence. The air grew thick as the implications of Lara's revelation hung heavy in the space. Susan's face drained of color as the reality of what she had just heard settled in. Her carefully constructed world, where Derek was the shining star, the one who had made it on his own, was crumbling before her eyes. Lara's influence had extended far beyond what Susan had ever assumed. Susan's lips parted as if to speak, but no words came out. Her eyes flicked to Derek, hoping for some kind of reaction, but Derek was staring at Lara, his face unreadable. For the first time, Susan was faced with the uncomfortable truth. Everything she had ever believed about Lara's place in the family was wrong. Derek, too, was beginning to process what Lara had just revealed. His mind raced as he recalled the countless conversations, the small hints Lara had dropped over the years.
It all made sense now.
His success had not been solely his doing. Lara had been the driving force behind so much of it. He had always assumed his achievements were a product of his own efforts, but now he was realizing that Lara's financial support and strategic guidance had been the real reason for his success. For the first time, Derek began to understand the power dynamics in their relationship. He had been the one at the forefront, the one people saw, but it was Lara who had been quietly pulling the strings behind the scenes. The stark truth was that everything his mother had tried to teach him about control and dominance, about keeping Lara in her place, was based on a complete misunderstanding of what had actually been going on all along. Lara saw the shift in Derek's expression, the understanding dawning in his eyes. She didn't take any satisfaction in it. She wasn't trying to prove a point for the sake of it. What she needed now, what she had always needed, was the respect that came with the truth. "I'm not asking for credit for Derek's success," Lara continued, her voice steady and sure. "But I will not let anyone belittle me or pretend that I haven't contributed to this family's wealth and standing. I've worked hard and I've sacrificed a lot, and I'm done being made to feel like I don't belong." Her words hung in the air as the reality of the situation began to settle in. Susan had spent years undermining Lara, but now, in this one moment, Lara had taken control. She wasn't asking for approval. She wasn't looking for accolades. She was simply demanding the respect she had always deserved. And, for the first time, it seemed like Derek and everyone else in the room was finally starting to understand that. Lara stood up slowly, the weight of the moment settling around her. She could feel the eyes of Derek and his family on her, the tension in the air palpable. She had spent years feeling like she needed their approval, their acceptance, but not anymore. Tonight, she had reclaimed her confidence, her dignity, and her place in the world. As she gathered her things, she turned to face them, her back straight, her expression calm but resolute. "I don't need your validation," Lara said quietly, her words cutting through the silence. "I've built my life on my own terms, and I don't need any of you to define who I am. This is where I leave." The power in her voice was undeniable, and she could see it in their faces. Susan's shocked expression, Derek's sudden unease. It was all too late. Lara had made her decision. She wasn't the person she had been when she first walked into this room. She was no longer the woman they could dismiss, the woman they could manipulate. She had taken back control of her own narrative, and no one, especially not them, was going to take that away from her. Before she turned to walk away, she glanced at Susan, her eyes narrowing with a quiet intensity. "You've spent years trying to tear me down, Susan," she said, her voice steady. "But no matter what you do, I will always stand tall. You will never humiliate me again." The finality in her words echoed in the room as she turned and walked toward the door. She didn't need to look back. She knew exactly what she was leaving behind and what she was walking into. As Lara reached the door, she heard Derek speak, his voice hesitant, unsure. "Lara, wait." But it was too late. Lara had already stepped into the hallway, the door closing softly behind her. She didn't need to hear his apology. She didn't need his words anymore. The realization hit her hard. She had spent so long waiting for him to stand up for her, to fight for her. But tonight, for the first time, she realized she could fight for herself. She stepped out into the night air, taking a deep breath as she walked toward her car. The cool breeze was refreshing, a sharp contrast to the stifling atmosphere she had just left behind. Her mind was clear now. She had made her choice. She was no longer dependent on Derek or his family for validation. As she arrived at her penthouse, she took a moment to soak in the peace and freedom that washed over her. She had worked hard for this. Every sacrifice, every decision, it had all led her here, to this new beginning. She was a self-made woman, and for the first time in years, she felt like she was truly in control of her life. With a quiet smile, Lara walked into her apartment, ready to embrace the future on her own terms. The world was hers for the taking, and she was ready to seize it. As Lara stood in the quiet of her penthouse, the weight of the evening settled on her shoulders, but there was no longer a sense of burden. There was only strength. She had walked away from a life where she had been controlled, belittled, and made to feel insignificant. But now, she had chosen herself. The decision was not just about leaving Derek or his family behind. It was about reclaiming her own power, her own identity. She had broken free from the constraints they had placed on her, and for the first time in years, she felt truly free. The journey had been long and filled with challenges, but Lara had proven something crucial to herself. She was capable of standing tall, of fighting for what was hers, and of not allowing anyone to define her worth. Tonight had been a turning point, not just in her marriage, but in her entire life. She was no longer seeking validation from people who had never truly seen her. She had created her own path, and now it was up to her to walk it with confidence and purpose. Looking out over the city from her balcony, Lara knew this was just the beginning of a new chapter. She wasn't bound by the expectations of others anymore. The shackles had been removed, and in their place, she felt a newfound sense of independence. She was ready to take control of her life, not as an afterthought in someone else's story, but as the lead character in her own. This was her moment to step into the world unapologetically, to embrace everything she had worked for, and to continue building a life that was hers alone. With every step, every decision, Lara was shaping the future she had always deserved. She wasn't just moving forward. She was moving forward on her own terms, stronger, wiser, and more certain of who she was than ever before. The world was open to her now, and she was more than ready to take it on.